What was meant to be a night of planned humiliation turned into Madison's worst nightmare when Grace, the florist she tried to destroy, revealed a secret that could change not only Madison's life but the destiny of everyone present at the event. You'll never believe what happened. The Clarkson mansion resembled a fairy tale castle, but instead of princes and magic, it housed the icy walls of ambition. Madison Clarkson grew up in this world of luxury and power, where the word no was as rare as a solar eclipse. Her parents, real estate tycoons, not only built skyscrapers but also shaped their daughter to be impenetrable. To Madison, compassion was weakness, and ordinary people were either obstacles or tools for success. The glittering facade of her wealthy life was dazzling but hid an emptiness hard to ignore. At 27, Madison had a gaze that seemed to pierce through anyone. In her world, kindness was pointless, and she never hesitated to remind any employee of that. That's how Grace entered her orbit, a florist radiating lightness, crafting arrangements that felt like poetry in floral form. But Madison couldn't see past the dirt-streaked hands and unassuming smile of Grace. To her, Grace was just another insignificant cog in the family business. Yet, Grace exuded a unique energy that deeply irritated Madison. While Madison mingled at exclusive parties and strategic business dinners with people who never smiled without a calculated reason, Grace was her antithesis. Her laughter was effortless, her presence magnetic. Clients adored Grace, a fact that began to gnaw at Madison in inexplicable ways. How could someone without any pedigree attract such admiration? This question grew like a shadow in her mind. One sunny morning, Madison saw Grace chatting with a key client, laughing at something trivial. That was the breaking point. Grace, with her simplicity and charm, seemed to steal the spotlight from Madison, who thrived on being the center of attention. For the first time, Madison felt something she couldn't name: insecurity. Maybe it was envy. Perhaps it was something deeper, but she wasn't ready to confront it. Her heart, so used to indifference, thudded with an uncomfortable sense of threat. The irony was that Grace wasn't even trying to compete. Her world revolved around flowers, colors, and small gestures that brightened people's days. She didn't look at the millionaires frequenting her shop as superior. To her, everyone was equal, and somehow, this was even more intolerable to Madison. After all, how could someone without wealth or status walk through life with such ease? Meanwhile, Madison remained engrossed in her routine of coldly calculated meetings and strategies. Her life had no room for gentleness, yet something about Grace seemed to defy this logic. Each floral arrangement felt like a silent provocation, a reminder that life could be simple and beautiful without millions in the bank. This contrast between their realities was starting to weigh on Madison, though she refused to admit it. Deep down, a larger shadow loomed over Madison: the fear of not being enough. Despite her luxurious life, she knew that everything she had was inherited, a reflection of her parents' efforts, not her own accomplishments. Grace's humility and authenticity seemed to expose this truth without even trying. The comparison was unavoidable, and Madison despised every second of it. That's when Madison decided she needed to act, not to understand Grace but to reassert her control. She wanted to prove to herself that she was still the most powerful person in the room, even if it meant extinguishing the light that seemed to shine in Grace. In Madison's world, there was no room for losers, and she refused to be one. A plan began to form in her mind, an idea as cold as the marble adorning her mansion. But as Madison schemed, something greater was in motion. Life, with its unpredictability, was about to turn the tables in ways she could never expect. Grace, unknowingly, held a power that would transform not only her own life but also Madison's frozen heart. And without realizing it, Madison was walking toward a reckoning that would change everything. Madison watched Grace from afar, increasingly unsettled by how her presence seemed to attract smiles and compliments that were not meant for her. Sitting in her leather chair in a sleek, expansive office, Madison drummed her fingers on the desk as an idea emerged. A charity gala. Of course, it was perfect. A luxurious event filled with important personalities where Grace, with all her simplicity, wouldn't belong. The plan began to take shape, every detail carefully designed to highlight Grace's unsuitability. Madison knew exactly how to lure Grace into her web. The invitation was cloaked as an opportunity. "You'll have a unique chance to showcase your work to high society," she said with a smile that concealed her true intentions. Grace, humble and surprised, hesitated, but Madison insisted, peppering the offer with words like exposure and growth potential. To Madison, putting Grace in an embarrassing situation seemed like the perfect coup. As the event preparations unfolded, a flicker of doubt began to creep into Madison's mind. Was this truly necessary? But she quickly pushed the thought aside, convincing herself that it was simply a test for Grace, a way to show her that the world wasn't as kind as she seemed to believe. Envy and the need to reaffirm her superiority spoke louder. After all, she was a Clarkson, and Clarksons never hesitated. Grace, on the other hand, faced an internal whirlwind. The proposal seemed too good to be true, and her intuition warned her to be cautious. Yet, another voice whispered about how this might be a golden opportunity. Perhaps it was time to step out of her comfort zone and show that, even without a prominent last name, she could achieve something remarkable. Torn between excitement and hesitation, Grace started to consider accepting. Madison, noticing Grace's lack of a definitive response, decided to apply pressure. She called personally, something she rarely did, to reiterate how unmissable this chance was. "I even thought of someone more experienced, but I felt it would be interesting to give an opportunity to someone as promising as you," she said, masking the statement with false compliments. That was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Grace's heart. Maybe Madison was being genuine. Meanwhile, Madison orchestrated the event's details with surgical precision. Her personal assistant, suspicious of her boss's motives, didn't dare question her. The chosen dress was carefully curated, both eye-catching and disastrous. Madison wanted Grace to be remembered, but for all the wrong reasons. It was almost a work of art, a cruelty meticulously designed. Grace eventually gave in. Despite her doubts, she decided to accept the invitation, imagining it might be her big chance to expand her small business. "Be brave," she told herself as she hung up the phone with Madison. Excitement began to mix with anxiety, but Grace, true to her optimism, chose to focus on the positive. Perhaps this really was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Madison, on the other hand, silently celebrated. Her plan was in motion, and she couldn't wait to watch it unfold. She pictured Grace arriving at the event, swallowed by the critical gazes of the elite. There was no room for mistakes. Everything was going exactly as she envisioned. The event promised to be memorable, though not for the reasons Grace hoped. The invitation sparked rumors within the company. Employees, aware of the silent rivalry between Madison and Grace, began whispering discreetly. Many sympathized with Grace, but few believed she was prepared for such a grand event. Still, no one dared to oppose Madison, and the murmurs remained low, a backdrop to the rising tension. And so, the days passed, each one bringing Grace closer to the moment that would change her life. Madison remained immersed in her preparations, increasingly confident that her masterpiece of humiliation would succeed. But fate, in its irony, had something very different in store for them both. The stage was set, but the performance to be played was beyond Madison's control. Grace held the invitation with slightly trembling hands, staring intently at the words that promised a world of opportunities. Exposure, visibility, once-in-a-lifetime chance. It all seemed so grand, yet something felt off. A knot tightened in her stomach at the thought of being surrounded by people so different from her, in an environment that always made her feel out of place. Could Madison really be sincere? Or was this a trap waiting to spring? Sitting in her small apartment, her eyes fixed on the vibrant flowers in her garden under the afternoon sun, Grace questioned her courage. She wanted to believe she could stand out, but doubt was overwhelming. What if I'm not good enough? What if I become a laughingstock? She murmured to herself. It felt as if her intuition was warning her to stay away, but at the same time, a tiny flame of hope burned, a desire to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could change her life. Meanwhile, Madison observed Grace's indecision with a mix of impatience and satisfaction. Why was it so hard for Grace to simply accept? Did she suspect something? Madison battled a rare flicker of doubt that kept surfacing. Was this an unnecessary cruelty? But as always, she dismissed such thoughts. There was no room for weakness in her life. Madison needed to prove, to Grace and to herself, that she still held all the power. Grace's hesitation began to show in her work. Her colleagues noticed she was more distracted, less cheerful. When questioned, she responded with a forced smile and changed the subject. Deep down, Grace knew this decision wasn't just about accepting or declining an invitation. It was about facing her fears, about proving that even without the glitter of wealth, she could achieve something extraordinary. But that courage felt as distant as the stars in the sky. Impatient with Grace's delay, Madison decided to act. She approached Grace personally at her shop, something she rarely did, and with a smile hiding her true intent, said, "Don't worry, Grace. If you're not comfortable, I can always find someone else. Honestly, though, I thought you had more ambition." Those words, spoken with almost casual cruelty, struck Grace like a blow. Her wounded pride began to outweigh her doubts, even as uncertainty lingered. Grace spent the entire night pondering. Sitting at her dining table, surrounded by flower catalogs and unpaid bills, she mentally listed the pros and cons. What if this is a real opportunity? What if I don't try and regret it for the rest of my life, she thought. But the fear of failure still gripped her tightly. She searched for strength within herself, but all she found were reasons to doubt her abilities. The invitation lay on the table, a constant reminder of her dilemma. Madison, on the other hand, felt victorious. Each day without a definitive response from Grace was a small win. In her mind, the plan was proceeding exactly as intended. Grace would eventually accept. Madison was sure of it. After all, people like Grace, with their simple lives, couldn't resist the promise of something greater. This was the logic Madison knew, and she clung to it as an absolute certainty. However, something inside Grace began to shift. It was as if a quiet voice deep within her was urging her to stop hiding. Despite all her doubts and fears, a spark of determination was emerging. She remembered the time she had overcome greater challenges, the moments she had proven to herself that she was stronger than she believed. Maybe it's time to take a chance, she whispered to herself, though insecurity still followed her like a shadow. The next morning, Grace finally made her decision. With her heart in her throat, she picked up the phone and called Madison, accepting the invitation with a voice that trembled slightly. "Perfect," Madison replied with a false sweetness that masked her satisfaction. Grace hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and fear. She still didn't know if she had made the right choice, but she was determined to give it her all. What she didn't know was that this decision would set everything into motion. As the days passed and the event drew closer, Grace tried to push aside the anxiety that consumed her. Every detail of the gala felt like a mountain to climb. She knew she was stepping into a world that didn't accept her, but something inside her told her to keep moving forward. Unbeknownst to her, Grace was about to discover strength she never knew she had, while Madison was about to learn that controlling others doesn't always lead to the desired outcome. The moment Madison had been eagerly awaiting finally arrived. As Grace stepped onto the stage, the lights enveloped her like a spotlight on her vulnerability. The ostentatious dress, carefully chosen by Madison, made Grace stand out, but in a way that seemed to amplify her perceived inadequacy. Stifled laughter rippled through the audience, and Grace felt the weight of every gaze that seemed to judge her. Her fingers clutched the fabric of her dress as if it could shield her from the humiliation unfolding before her. Madison, strategically positioned among the guests, watched the scene with a satisfied smile. This was her victory, or so she thought. Everything was going according to plan, and Grace's discomfort was precisely what she had aimed to provoke. To Madison, this wasn't just a charity event, it was a stage for her to reaffirm her superiority. But there was one variable she hadn't anticipated, the presence of Oliver, whose watchful eyes missed nothing. Oliver saw Grace there, exposed but not defeated. Though clearly uncomfortable, there was something in her posture that defied the logic of the situation. He didn't see a victim but a woman fighting to maintain her dignity amidst the chaos. Resolving to act, he discreetly made his way closer, ready to intervene in a way no one expected. his mind already mapped out his next move as the tension in the room continued to grow. Grace, meanwhile, felt every second on that stage stretch into an eternity. The sound of laughter echoed in her mind, but rather than let the shame consume her, she focused on what mattered most to her. "I didn't come here to please anyone," she thought, trying to draw strength from her own words. She had no idea that, at that very moment, someone was about to turn the situation into something that would change everything. As Oliver moved among the guests, Madison began to notice him more closely. Something about the way he looked at Grace unsettled her. He wasn't laughing or judging like the others. On the contrary, there was a gleam in his eyes, as if he saw something no one else did. Madison felt control slipping ever so slightly from her grasp, and it deeply unnerved her. This was not how the night was supposed to unfold. When Oliver finally stepped onto the stage, the murmurs in the crowd fell silent. His commanding presence and reputation ensured that every move he made drew attention. Calmly, he asked for the microphone, his gaze fixed on Grace. "Before we continue, I'd like to say a few words about someone here tonight," he began. His voice was steady but charged with emotion. Grace looked at him, confused, as the entire room held its breath in silence. Madison froze. This wasn't part of the plan. Oliver wasn't supposed to be involved, and the way he was taking charge of the moment felt like a direct challenge to her carefully orchestrated night. She tried to maintain her composure, but every word he spoke seemed to threaten the house of cards she had built. "This woman, whom many of you might not know well, is responsible for something extraordinary," Oliver continued, leaving the crowd intrigued. For the first time that night, Madison felt a pang of fear. What followed was a revelation that shocked everyone present. Oliver revealed that Grace, anonymously, had been funding artistic projects in her hometown, transforming the lives of dozens of young people. He called her the Silent Muse, a nickname she never expected to hear in such a setting. Grace was speechless as the room, once filled with laughter and disdain, began to buzz with murmurs of admiration. Madison watched, pale-faced, realizing her plan was spiraling completely out of control. The silence broke into applause. At first, hesitant and scattered, but it quickly grew until the entire room was clapping for Grace. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Oliver gave her an encouraging smile, while Madison, now relegated to the background, struggled to process what was happening. The stage, meant to be the scene of humiliation, had transformed into a moment of triumph. And this was only the beginning. The applause still echoed as Grace stepped off the stage, dazed. Each step felt lighter, though her heart was racing. She felt vulnerable, but in an unexpected way, no longer the target of judgmental gazes, but the center of admiration. Around her, people began to approach, offering compliments and asking about her initiatives. It was as if her moment on stage had stripped away her invisibility and placed her under a light she had never sought but now couldn't avoid. As Grace tried to absorb everything, Oliver stayed close, shielding her from the more invasive stares. "You did this on your own, you know? No one can take that away from you," he said with an encouraging smile. Grace barely knew how to respond. Her mind was a swirl of confusion and gratitude. It felt surreal how a night destined for disaster had turned into something so meaningful. Yet deep down, she still wondered, is this real? Or just a fleeting moment that will soon fade? Across the room, Madison watched the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and frustration. How had this happened? Her meticulously crafted plan had backfired, turning Grace, the insignificant florist, into the center of attention. Every compliment directed at Grace felt like a blow to Madison's armor. But she wasn't ready to concede defeat. Not yet. She made her way to the bar, trying to regain her composure and strategize her next move. Meanwhile, Grace continued to be surrounded by people curious about her story. Some asked about the projects she funded, while others simply praised her courage for standing out in such an intimidating setting. Grace, still shy, answered as best she could, but she felt her words never truly conveyed what she was feeling. That's when Oliver stepped in again, steering the conversation toward the importance of altruistic actions and how their impact often resonates far beyond what we imagine. Madison, on the other hand, found an unlikely ally, her own conscience. She began to realize that what bothered her most about the night wasn't just Grace's unexpected success, but the mirror it held up to her. Grace was everything Madison wasn't: genuine, selfless, and admired for her own merits. For the first time, Madison couldn't find solace in her wealth or status. A pang of something she had avoided her whole life, regret, pierced her chest. Oliver continued to observe Madison from afar. He saw something in her that no one else seemed to notice, an internal struggle. As cold and calculated as she appeared, Oliver knew even the hardest hearts could change. He didn't confront her directly, but his words on stage had planted a seed. Sometimes the greatest challenge isn't recognizing others' faults, but facing our own, he had said, his gaze briefly meeting Madison's. Grace, still overwhelmed by the flurry of compliments and questions, finally found a moment to breathe. She stepped aside to a quieter corner of the hall, where she could reflect. It all felt surreal, yet deeply significant. She remembered all the times she doubted herself, the times she thought her work didn't matter. Now, in this moment, she knew she had been wrong. Her voice, though often silent, had found a way to resonate. Madison, finishing her second drink at the bar, began to feel the weight of her actions. She tried to justify what she had done with excuses that no longer convinced her. It was clear that Grace wasn't the problem. The problem was her own insecurity, which she had spent years masking with arrogance and manipulation. The realization was uncomfortable but undeniable. Madison knew something within her needed to change, though the idea of starting felt terrifying. The event carried on, but the focus of the night had shifted completely. Grace, with her quiet presence, had transformed the atmosphere without even trying. And Madison, still grappling with her own shame, began to see that perhaps there was something to learn from the evening. The room buzzed with activity. After Oliver's unexpected revelation about Grace, the audience couldn't contain themselves. Whispers, questions, and incredulous glances spread like wildfire. Several guests approached Madison, demanding more information. Why didn't we know about this before? Who is she really? What's this project all about? Madison, still processing the night's turn of events, stammered out something unintelligible. For the first time in years, she had no answers. Sensing Madison's discomfort, one guest pressed further, "You should call them back to the stage. This is a charity event, isn't it? They need to share this story with all of us." Cornered and without a way out, Madison nodded. She knew she had to regain some semblance of control, or at least pretend she was part of the moment. Forcing a smile, she climbed back onto the stage and called for the crowd's attention. "Oliver and Grace, I think everyone here would love to hear more about this. Silent Muse and the work you've been doing." Oliver exchanged a quick glance with Grace, who was clearly hesitant to step into the spotlight again. But he knew this was the moment to turn an incident into something bigger. Taking her hand in a gesture of support, they walked together onto the stage. The room grew quiet, with eyes now filled with admiration, curiosity, and, for some, even regret for their hasty judgments. Grace, though reluctant, knew she had to speak, not to defend herself, but to help others understand that true impact doesn't come from grandeur, but from action. Oliver started. "At some point, we all look for something, or someone, that inspires us. For me, the Silent Muse was exactly that. For years, I've heard stories about young people finding hope and purpose thanks to the funding of artistic and community projects in a small town. We never knew who was behind it until, by chance, some pieces came together tonight." He looked at Grace, encouraging her to continue. Grace took a deep breath before speaking. "I never wanted anyone to know," she said, her voice hesitant at first. "It was never about me. I just wanted to help people find something that made them believe in themselves. I grew up with very little, but I always believed that even with a little, we can do something meaningful." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "I didn't need spotlights or big events for that. I just did what I could with what I had." Grace's honesty swept through the audience like a wave. She explained how she used part of her modest income as a florist to support young talents, fund small events, and contribute to community projects. I always preferred anonymity because it was never about people knowing who I was. The impact mattered more than the recognition. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion. Each word seemed to resonate deeply with everyone present. Oliver then added, "What Grace has done reminds us that impact doesn't always come from grand gestures, but from small, consistent, and sincere ones. And that's something everyone here can learn from." He looked directly at Madison as he said this, a silent message that didn't go unnoticed. Madison, who had been avoiding everyone's gaze, felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest, a mix of shame and admiration. The room erupted into applause once more, but this time with a different energy. It wasn't just admiration, it was genuine recognition that Grace represented something many had forgotten. Madison, watching closely, felt small in the face of something so simple and honest. It was as if, in that moment, her own existence lost a bit of the meaning it once held. As Grace and Oliver stepped down from the stage, they were surrounded by guests eager to learn more, participate, and contribute. Grace, still feeling out of her comfort zone, answered as best she could while Oliver shielded her from the overwhelming attention. Meanwhile, Madison stayed silent, but something inside her began to shift. It was as if this moment had sparked a flicker of something she could barely identify. Amid the commotion, Madison made a decision. She needed to talk to Grace. Not as a businesswoman trying to manipulate the situation, but as someone seeking redemption. The question tormenting her was, would Grace even listen? Madison was restless. While people continued to marvel at Grace and her story, she felt increasingly isolated in her corner of the room. The emptiness that once filled her thoughts was now replaced by an unbearable weight. The realization that she had failed not just as a host, but as a person. For the first time, Madison experienced the humiliation she had so often inflicted on others, only this time, she was both the author and victim of her own plot. Oliver, observing from a distance, knew this was a crucial moment. He approached Madison with the calm of someone who understood that true change is born from discomfort. "You know, Madison, recognizing where we've gone wrong isn't weakness. It's courage. And sometimes, that's what it takes to become who we're meant to be." His words, though free of judgment, struck Madison deeply. She looked away but knew he was right. Oliver left her to her thoughts, confident that the seed of regret had already been planted. The audience, once distracted, was now fully aligned with Grace's story. Many approached her to express gratitude and ask how they could get involved in her projects. Grace, with her usual modesty, did her best to respond, but she felt like a stranger in the luxurious environment. She had never sought attention, and the sudden notoriety was almost uncomfortable. Still, she felt a quiet gratitude realizing her story was inspiring others. Madison, still lost in reflection, was interrupted by an unexpected question from a guest. "And what about you, Madison? How are you going to help with all this?" The question struck her like lightning. Until then, she had spent the evening justifying herself internally, but now she was being confronted directly. Oliver's distant gaze seemed to reinforce the question. Madison felt her cheeks flush. She didn't have an answer, at least, not yet. Taking what felt like a leap into the unknown, Madison finally approached Grace. The noise around them seemed to fade as if the entire room were attuned to the moment. "Grace," the words stuck in her throat. Madison had never needed to apologize to anyone before, and now that she did, she didn't know how. Grace looked at her with surprise but also with a calmness that only deepened Madison's insecurity. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Madison finally said, mustering the courage to meet Grace's eyes. "What I did, it was cruel, and you didn't deserve it." "No one does, actually." Grace remained silent for a moment, assessing the sincerity in Madison's words. "I truly am sorry, and I know that an apology isn't enough. But I want to know if there's anything I can do to make it right." Grace, though surprised, wasn't entirely closed off to the possibility of forgiveness. "You know, Madison, what you did hurt. But I think what matters more is what you choose to do from now on. This isn't about me or this event. It's about how you decide to use what you have to do something good." Her words, spoken without bitterness, felt like a mirror held up to Madison. She felt the weight of Grace's statement and, for the first time, saw herself not as a Clarkson, but as someone with the power to change. Oliver, watching the exchange, felt a glimmer of hope. He knew Madison had a long road ahead, but he also knew this was the first step. As she walked away from Grace, Madison felt a strange sense of relief she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if, in admitting her faults, a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But at the same time, a new burden replaced it: the responsibility to do better. The event was winding down, but the story of Grace and Madison was just beginning. Madison, who had spent her life building walls around herself, now faced the daunting task of tearing them down. Grace, who had never sought to be the center of attention, found herself as a symbol of how small actions can change lives. And Oliver, the bridge connecting their two realities, knew that this night would be remembered as a turning point for everyone present. The night had changed everything. Madison, who had planned an evening of humiliation, now faced the weight of regret. Grace's words echoed in her mind: "It's about how you decide to use what you have to do something good." For the first time, Madison wasn't thinking about wealth or status but about purpose. The emptiness she had long ignored felt more evident than ever, and now she wanted to fill that space with something that truly mattered. Grace, meanwhile, was exhausted but at peace. Talking to Madison had been harder than standing on stage or facing the judgmental gazes of the elite. She believed Madison was capable of change, but it wasn't something that could be forced. Forgiveness, though given, came with the hope that future actions would prove Madison's sincerity. Grace didn't need more apologies. She needed concrete gestures that showed the words were more than just a moment of weakness. Oliver, ever observant, noticed the subtle transformation in Madison. He saw her approach a few people at the event, not with her usual air of superiority, but with something closer to vulnerability. It was as if she was trying to piece together a life that once seemed so perfect but now revealed its cracks. He knew Madison had the potential to change, but he also knew it would take courage and consistency. The next morning, Madison woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Sitting at her lavish breakfast table in silence, she decided she needed to start somewhere. Picking up the phone, she called her assistant. "I want you to schedule a meeting with the team. We need to review our policies and find ways to support community projects." "Something sustainable, something real," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. It was a small step but one that carried significant weight. Meanwhile, Grace returned to her routine with a lighter heart. She knew her story had inspired many people the night before, but she wouldn't let it change who she was. The humble florist who found ways to help others would remain the same. Recognition was temporary, but the impact she could create was eternal. Back in her shop, surrounded by the scent of the flowers she loved, she began preparing new arrangements, just as she always had. Madison also began taking action. In a meeting with her team, she proposed creating a fund to support small businesses and community projects. The idea was met with surprise but also enthusiasm. Many employees, who once saw her as distant and unfeeling, began to notice a change in her demeanor. Madison didn't know if they fully believed in her yet, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was trying. Oliver, as always, stayed in the background, watching as Grace and Madison began to shape their new paths. He knew Grace would remain a quiet force of kindness and that Madison still had much to learn. But seeing the start of their transformations was enough for him. "Sometimes, the hardest thing is taking the first step," he said to Grace during a visit to her flower shop. "And both of you have done that." Madison and Grace didn't become friends overnight. There was still distrust and barriers to overcome. But there was also a quiet respect beginning to form. A week later, Madison visited Grace's shop with an unexpected request. "I'd like you to help me figure out how to do this right. I don't want to just do what looks good. I want to do what's right." Grace studied her for a moment, searching her eyes for sincerity, then nodded. "We can start with a conversation," she said. The reward of that night wasn't just for Grace or Madison but for everyone involved. It was proof that even the most unexpected connections could bring about something positive. Madison, once driven by envy and power, began to find purpose in collaboration. Grace, who never sought the spotlight, continued to inspire others quietly wherever she went. As days turned into weeks, The story of that night kept circulating. For many, it was just a memorable event, but for Grace and Madison, it marked the beginning of something far greater. Something neither of them could fully predict, but both were willing to explore together. Madison walked into her office one morning with a different energy. The space, once adorned with symbols of power and wealth, now felt oppressive in a way she hadn't noticed before. She glanced at the papers on her desk, realizing the goals and reports that once represented success now felt hollow. She knew she needed change, but the how was still a mystery. She felt like someone waking up in a foreign land without a map or guide. Meanwhile, Grace continued her routine in the flower shop, but the impact of that night still resonated in her heart. She received messages from people who had been at the event, some offering praise, others asking for advice on how they could help in their own communities. Grace, ever humble, responded as best she could, emphasizing that what mattered wasn't grand gestures but starting with what you had. Small acts can be just as powerful as big ones, she often said. Determined to create something meaningful, Madison began organizing meetings with community leaders and social impact experts. The early discussions were uncomfortable. She felt out of her depth listening to stories of struggles she'd never imagined. Yet, each conversation sparked something within her. Slowly, Madison began to see beyond her bubble of privilege, realizing that wealth wasn't an end in itself. At one such meeting, Madison invited Grace to join. Initially hesitant, Grace decided to accept. If I can help guide these changes, why not try, she thought. During the meeting, Madison surprised everyone by admitting her lack of experience and asking for guidance. I want this to be more than just a facade. I want to create something that truly makes a difference, and I know I need to listen to those who understand this better than I do. It was a moment of vulnerability Madison couldn't have imagined showing just months ago. Grace, seeing the sincerity in Madison's words, agreed to collaborate. She shared ideas about how small actions could create lasting change. It doesn't always have to be complicated. Sometimes, it's about supporting a small local project or giving opportunities to those who've never had a chance, she explained. Madison listened intently, jotting down notes like a dedicated student. The contrast with the woman who had schemed to humiliate her weeks earlier was striking. As they worked together, Madison began to notice something surprising. She and Grace weren't as different as she had assumed. Both wanted to make an impact, though their paths up to that point had been starkly opposite. This realization not only brought them closer but also deepened Madison's commitment to change. The transformation wasn't easy, but for the first time, she felt she was on the right path. The new initiative from Madison's company, focused on supporting social projects, began to take shape. Instead of making decisions alone, Madison involved Grace and other community members in the process. If we're going to do this, we need to listen to the people who truly know what needs to be done, she said at one meeting. The change in her approach was evident, and those around her started to see Madison in a new light. Grace, on the other hand, found a renewed sense of purpose in her partnership with Madison. While she still loved her flower shop, she discovered she could do more through the initiative. Watching Madison genuinely strive to change and succeed was inspiring. For Grace, it was proof that even the most unlikely people could transform if they were willing to face their flaws and learn from them. Madison's journey was far from linear. She faced resistance from people who doubted her sincerity, as well as moments of self-doubt. But with Grace by her side and Oliver's steady guidance, she persisted. Each small step took her further from the hollow world she had lived in and closer to a life filled with purpose. As the initiative gained attention, the story of Grace and Madison continued to inspire others. Oliver, ever observant, summed it up simply: sometimes, the hardest path is the one that takes us where we need to be. And though Madison still had much to learn, she knew she was no longer on this journey alone. Grace, with her humility and quiet strength, had become not just a collaborator but an unlikely friend. Madison was different. Her gestures, once calculated and distant, now carried a new lightness. What began as an effort to atone for her mistakes had evolved into a mission that redefined her identity. Sitting in a modest room surrounded by community leaders and small business owners, she listened intently to their stories. Gone was the arrogance and disdain that once defined her. What remained was a woman learning to find meaning in a life that had always been superficial. Grace, always nearby, kept the focus on what truly mattered. When Madison wavered or felt uncertain, Grace was there to remind her, "It's about them, not about you. Keep listening." Their partnership had become more than professional. It was a friendship built on mutual respect and growth. Grace not only taught Madison to look outward but also inward, to parts of herself she had long ignored. The world around them wasn't always kind. Some still questioned Madison's motives, doubting whether her transformation was genuine or a strategy to repair her image. These criticisms, though painful, were a reminder that true change takes time and consistency. Madison learned to accept this, letting her actions speak louder than words. Every new project, every small positive impact, was a quiet response to the doubts. One of the most impactful initiatives was a program supporting women-led small businesses, an idea Grace suggested and Madison eagerly embraced. Together, they visited communities and heard stories of resilience and struggle. Madison, who once saw only numbers and charts, now saw people and their journeys. During one such visit, as they helped a young entrepreneur organize her store, Madison found herself unexpectedly moved. For the first time, she felt she was building something that truly mattered. Oliver, always observant, saw the depth of Madison's transformation. During a conversation, he remarked, "You know this doesn't erase what happened, right? But it's not about erasing. It's about building something new." Madison agreed, knowing she could never undo the past, but she did have the power to write a different future. That awareness gave her the strength to keep moving forward, even on the hardest days. Grace, too, was going through her own changes. She had always believed that silent actions were enough, but working alongside Madison showed her that sometimes you have to speak up more. Her voice, once timid, was now a tool to inspire others. Grace began to participate in talks and events, sharing her story and encouraging others to believe in the power of small gestures. She still preferred anonymity most of the time, but she was learning to balance her essence with the need to inspire. Their joint efforts began to attract national attention. Madison, who had once hidden behind a legacy built by her parents, was now being recognized for her own merit. But instead of seeking the spotlight, she directed it toward the communities and projects she supported. "It's not about me. It's about the impact we can create together," she would say in interviews, echoing the lessons she had learned from Grace. Madison's resurrection wasn't just about her image or career, it was about her humanity. The woman who had once humiliated Grace was now the first to applaud her at her talks. The luxury that had once defined her life had given way to a simplicity filled with purpose. And in the process, Madison not only changed her own trajectory but also inspired many others to believe that, yes, transformation is possible. Walking alongside Grace after another visit to a community project, Madison commented, "You know, I never imagined I'd be here, doing this." Grace smiled and replied, "I didn't imagine it either. But it's good to be here, isn't it?" And in that moment, both women knew that despite their differences, they shared something essential, the desire to do good and leave the world a little better than they found it. The story of Grace and Madison became an unexpected symbol of transformation and hope. As the months passed, the fruits of their initiatives began to blossom in small, yet significant, changes. Community projects that had once struggled to survive gained strength, small businesses grew, and young people who had lost hope found new opportunities. It wasn't just the tangible impact that marked the difference, it was the example these two women set, the possibility of redemption and collaboration, even between such different worlds. Madison, once surrounded by empty luxury, found meaning in every small achievement. She was no longer the woman who sought to control and humiliate. Now, she was someone who supported and learned. In interviews and events, her demeanor had completely changed. "My biggest mistake was believing that someone's worth was in their position or wealth. Today, I know the true value is in the impact we have on people's lives," she said, unhesitatingly acknowledging her past mistakes. Grace, who had always preferred simplicity and anonymity, saw her life transformed in ways she never expected. Her flower shop remained her safe haven, But now she was seen as a leader in her community, someone who inspired others to act. Despite the attention she received, Grace stayed true to herself, always returning to her roots. "I'm not special. I just do what I can with what I have," she would say, downplaying the praise directed at her. The partnership between Madison and Grace didn't just change their lives, it created a larger movement. Other businesses began to follow Madison's example, revising their practices and investing in local communities. People who had witnessed that night at the charity event, or had heard of it, began to rethink their own prejudices and privileges. It was as if the impact of their story reverberated far beyond what either woman could have imagined. Oliver, who had always been a quiet mentor, watched all of this unfold with a mix of pride and humility. He knew he wasn't the protagonist of the story, but he felt honored to have been a bridge between two such different people. At a community event, he remarked, "Madison and Grace show us that the most important thing isn't where we start, but where we choose to go. We all have the power to change and, more importantly, to help others change too." Over time, their story gained even more traction. Newspapers and television programs highlighted the impact they were making, and even a documentary was produced to tell the journey of Grace and Madison. But for the two of them, what truly mattered wasn't fame or recognition, it was the lives they were transforming. For Madison, this meant continuing to learn and striving to be a better leader. For Grace, it meant staying true to her principles, even amidst so many changes. During a casual visit to Grace's flower shop, Madison looked around and commented, "You know, all of this started because I wanted to humiliate you, right?" Grace smiled serenely. "And look where it's brought us. Life has a funny way of fixing things." They both laughed, but there was something deep in that moment. The acknowledgement that even the gravest mistakes could be transformed into something positive. Madison and Grace didn't just find meaning in their own lives. They also showed many others that, with courage and openness, it's possible to rewrite even the most difficult stories. And in the end, what remained was more than just a story of overcoming. It was a legacy of change and hope.